Thanks for joining us for our conversation on big ideas in education. We just came off of a very lively online summit. I'm Elizabeth Rich. I am the opinion editor for Education Week, and I'm also the executive project editor for Big Ideas in Education. So I'm going to introduce the three people I have with me, and then we're going to cut right to the conversation. So on my far right is Sterling Lloyd. He's the assistant director for the Education Week Research Center. Michelle Davis, who's a writer for Education Week, and Allison Klein, who's a technology reporter. So thanks for, it's a lot, right, to have these conversations for an hour and a half. But I can't wait to hear what you all were talking about. So Sterling, chat, who was in your booth? Who were you, who was the guest today, and who were you hearing from?
Well, our guest was Holly Kurtz, the director of the Education Week Research Center. We heard from a really diverse mix and robust mix of different stakeholders, including some superintendents and district leaders, but also some folks from education companies who are very interested in innovation and how to kind of get their products in the hands of educators and district leaders.
Yeah, and I know this issue of fostering innovation is a huge one. I know you guys all were talking about it in your booths. Are there any promising ideas that came out of the conversation today that you heard about?
Well, there was one big one that I liked. Our survey results suggest that time pressures and deadlines often prevent educators from innovating. So one of our audience members suggested sandboxes for innovation for educators where time would be reserved by the district to allow experimentation, trying things out. And I don't know if that's occurring anywhere across the country. I'd like to hear more from our audience, but I thought it was a promising idea.
That is really interesting. Speaking of surveys, you conducted a survey for this particular conversation around innovation. So did any of the conversation today echo what you found from the survey?
Well, our survey results really show that educators are not monolithic.
Right.
And that's probably not surprising. It makes sense, stands to reason. But I think it makes for a robust discussion. And we found that among the audience as well. District leaders think differently than teachers, who think differently than principals.
Exactly.
And they think differently than students. And so I think that kind of diversity of opinion is out there, and we see that both in the survey results and in the discussion today.
Right. I remember one thing from the survey result, which was that 47% of teachers say that student achievement is their most pressing issue around it, but only 9% said it was about keeping pace with the economy, which is really interesting. In contrast, the principals said it was actually 20% of them said it was about the economy. So that's...
Yeah, I think they're facing different pressures
right.
And different stakeholders. The district leaders are often out there in full view of the public, and they're dealing with politicians and people who kind of are putting pressure on them to deal with the economy and career readiness and college readiness.
Yes.
Where teachers are very focused on their classroom and on helping each student achieve.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Please.
I just wanted to say, in my booth, which was about, is school boring and is more meaningful learning for students going on outside the classroom, there was a great discussion of project-based learning and how that can really help students. But going to what Sterling said, there were a lot of folks who said, teachers really want to do this project-based learning. It's a little bit messy, but administrators are not always on board. There's a real difference in approach between teachers, principals, administrators, and even people on the school board. Especially when these types of projects, the outcome isn't guaranteed. It's not always going to be successful, or you're not always going to reach sort of the specific end goal.
Right. And it's always going to be, well, I shouldn't say always, but it's often going to be messy, as you mentioned.
Yes.
So your booth, you want to tell us what your booth was about?
Sure. So my booth sort of put a little bit of a skeptical eye, I would say, on this conversation about innovation. My guest was Lee Vinzel, who's a professor at Virginia Tech, and he's really talked about this idea of a maintenance mindset, which doesn't mean that you don't innovate or you don't try new things, but it does mean that you think through what you're already doing and whether or not it's working well, and making sure that the systems that you already have in place are functioning the way that they're supposed to. So basically, don't run out and buy fancy new tablets if your building is crumbling down, is sort of his overall message. And it's a really interesting one, especially within the context of this broader conversation about innovation.
Right. And did you hear, what kinds of things were you hearing in the booth about that? Were people skeptical themselves about, wait, I should chase this because it is going to promote innovation?
So I think as Sterling was talking about, I think there's a lot of of pressure on districts to innovate, to try. And I think a lot of that comes from, it's not just in education, right? It's this entire mindset that we're seeing across the economy today. A lot of it's driven by like Silicon Valley. But as Lee was pointing out, we've been really interested in innovation and trying new things since really, for centuries now. I mean, it's not new.
Right.
So some of the commentators found it, I think, kind of, I think we're agreeing with him and saw a lot of merit in his argument. One, though, worried a little bit. She said schools really haven't changed very much over the past, and we hear this a lot, over the past like 5 decades. If we aren't trying to chase innovation,
right.
What will, if we stop chasing innovation, how will things look?
And to your booth, one of the questions that came up is, if school's boring, what are some ways to address that, right?
Yeah.
Beyond the sandbox, what were you hearing?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of discussion about ed tech, and I want to piggyback on something that Allison said, is that we've written about this, that a lot of schools aren't even using the ed tech that they have properly. Districts are wasting millions of dollars on software that they've already purchased, but that no one's using.
Yeah.
And I think, what I've seen in terms of making school less boring, one of the things is, districts who are really successful in using ed tech to engage students are the ones that invest in professional learning and professional development with their teachers and really do things like what you're talking about with the sandbox, really give teachers an opportunity to learn how to use this ed tech, to learn how to use it in an innovative way,
Right.
not just, replacing a worksheet with something that's on a computer screen.
Right, because that's not really innovative. I mean, that's just, using a different medium.
Right.
So I'm curious, Allison, in terms of this maintenance mindset, like once you have something, like what's the perspective on that, the advice, basically?
So Lee's big advice for districts when it comes to, having a maintenance mindset is that you really first want to come to grips with what you have. Take stock of what's already there, as Michelle was talking about with this unused software. And it's not just technology. It can be, facilities. It can be, what kind of talent that you already have. What's already there? Take stock of that. He talks about planning ahead and trying things. Like the sandbox approach is actually a good thought here, trying things in small pilots as opposed to going big all at once, and that way you can work out the bugs and the kinks. And then I love this third point that he has, which is recognizing the maintainers. The people who come up with the big, shiny new idea
Right.
are often the folks who are most celebrated within school districts, but he's talking about recognizing these sometimes more introverted people who are just keeping the trains running on time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder, Sterling, in terms of the data, and in terms of educators actually trying to innovate, like how often is that happening? What were you also seeing in your booth about that?
We found that educators in the survey were about evenly split between those who want to innovate daily, those who try monthly or
Right.
weekly, and those who try just a handful of times a year. And the best approach is probably in the eye of the beholder. I think there was a legendary basketball coach, John Wooden, who said that we should never mistake activity for achievement.
Yeah.
And so just trying a lot of different things every day on small tasks may help in some ways.
Yeah.
But then I think others are looking for kind of landmark innovations that may only happen, once a year, if that. And I think in our booth, we also found people who, felt like they tried to innovate, but they stopped. They felt like they didn't get support, that, people wanted to just chase a shiny new object
Right.
rather than focusing on things that really worked and providing resources for innovations that made a difference.
I mean, do you think there's anything there, Allison, in terms of what Sterling just said and the maintenance mindset, that there might be some way to rethink innovation?
I mean, my guess is, and this is not probably that novel of an idea, right, is that you probably have to balance these two things
Right.
and make sure that you're continuing to innovate but not forget about
Right.
this maintenance piece. And I mean, I think that can be a difficult thing for leaders to balance.
Right. And it's also not as sexy, right?
No.
It's like taking care of what you have, whatever. But that shiny new thing over there, that's much more exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and student-based learning, project-based learning, which you've already mentioned, has come up a lot in all the booths and came up a lot in the early questions that we got, 10 days ago. So what sorts of things were you hearing specifically? Did people have ideas, or was it just more of a general conversation around project-based learning and student-centered learning?
Yeah, there were a lot of ideas that kind of flew around. One thing that people talked about was, we need to, this is a discussion about what's boring for students. We need to ask the students and have the students in on this discussion. There were a couple people who raised the issue that there were no students, participating in the discussion. And one thing I brought up was Education Week had done a report on student-centered learning, and within that report we did a story about a school that was providing professional development alongside students. Students were incorporated into the professional development and giving specific feedback to the teachers about what was interesting to them, what connected them to the topic, and what they'd like to see more or less of. So I think part of it is to ask the students, what is it that's boring and what's resonating for you?
So, and here's a philosophical question. I mean, is boring such a terrible thing? And we had this conversation actually in the newsroom the other day. There's been a lot of controversy around gamifying like certain historical events that are traumatic and tragic, because teachers or educators are trying to get their students more engaged. I mean, what is your feeling about that? Obviously, you're not in the classroom, but I'm just kind of curious from your perspective.
I mean, speaking as someone who goes to work every day, most of the time my job is really exciting here at Education Week. But there are times when, you really have to learn how to just buckle down and get through something.
Right.
So I would think in terms of preparing students for the future of work, that it's okay for certain things to be a little bit boring. I'm wondering, Michelle, what your take is on that.
Well, I mean, I think there's a big difference between handing out a math worksheet and you have a piece of paper and you have to fill in your calculations, and doing something a little bit more interesting, having a project where you have to take measurements or you have to use a formula to calculate things. So, I think there's a big jump between, the worksheet sort of model and something else. And I think, teachers can get there.
And I think we've written about the fact that more and more top companies are embracing the culture of innovation, the culture of productive failure, encouraging experimentation and the willingness to fail and try things. And you don't get that from drill and kill. But at the same time, I think we all recognize you need to practice and you need to drill at times. But you also need to learn to come up with new ideas. That's what this whole innovation discussion is all about.
Right.
And there was a discussion in my booth about the issue of testing and having to be on the same page as the rest of the district or the rest of the department at a certain time, and that really does impact the ability to be innovative and to be engaging to students.
Well, and I also think, to your point about this innovation mindset, I do feel like if we understand that we need to take care of the things that we have, whether it's our earth or our technology, that it does give young people an idea that both of these things can exist at the same time, right? You don't need to chase down every new thing, but at the same time you can actually take care of what you have. So are there any final thoughts that any of you want to share with our audience before we say goodbye?
Well, I just want to thank everybody who participated in the discussion and thank our guests.
Yeah, and I would just like to say I found the conversation at my booth, and I know others did too, very thoughtful, that I was encouraged that people are thinking about these issues and really wanting to improve.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much, and stay tuned. We'll be back with a conversation on testing, equity, and special education. Thanks for joining us. This is the conversation that we're having following the Big Ideas in Education Summit, which was very active. I'm Elizabeth Rich. I'm the opinion editor for Education Week, and I'm also the executive project editor for Big Ideas. And I'm really excited that all of the reporters who participated today were able to join us for this conversation. On my far right is Steven Sawchuk. He's an associate editor who covers districts, but he's also a geek for testing. You love testing, and you're the guy in the
It
newsroom.
looks great on my online dating profile, let me tell you.
And Christina Samuels is our education equity reporter who also covered special education for a while, several years at Education Week. And I would say if we ever have any questions about special ed, she's the person we go to. And Daryl, you're our school finance reporter and a military brat, and also came up with this really interesting idea for Big Ideas. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about it. So let's start with you, actually. What was your big idea? And tell me a little bit about what happened in your booth.
So my big idea was that there should be more research on the academic outcomes of Black students whose parents are in the military. These students perform extraordinarily well. Military students in general perform better than typical civilian kids, despite the fact that they move 6 to 9 times a year. But what's most fascinating about this data is that there's very little achievement gap, and so there's a new indicator under the Every Student Succeeds Act in which districts are required to start tracking these students. And I implore researchers and practitioners to start digging into this data to see what are some of the things that these students are experiencing that make their experiences in schools unique and maybe can lead to these sorts of outcomes.
And can you also just clue us in a little bit about how you came on this idea in the first place?
My childhood was traumatic, so I attended 13 different schools, and my academic experience was like sort of all over the map. And when I first got into education reporting, I came across this tiny New York Times story. It was buried in the back of the papers about this fascinating data about Black kids whose parents were in the military, that they were kind of scoring on NAEP tests just extraordinarily well. But because there was so little data about this, there were a lot of questions but very few answers. And so that story was published maybe 15 years ago. So I kind of wanted to just kind of see what was actually happening in the field. And apparently this is something that a lot of researchers, a lot of practitioners are very curious about. There's a lot of scrambling. There's a lot of, folks trying to talk to each other, trying to dig into data. And just in the last couple of months, my story was published back in January, but just in the last couple of months, there's been just a flood of research.
Yeah.
There are 20 states now that are reporting this, and people are asking questions. They're finding that actually, Black kids actually, even when they're put in civilian schools, they are performing just as well as white kids in many states. So this is there's a lot of questions in this area.
Right,
Yeah.
and the moving around is like the huge big piece of
Right,
this.
because moving just once
Right.
can be detrimental. It can derail a kid's
Right.
kid's academic trajectory, and in this instance, is actually helping them out academically somehow. So
Right. So, Christina, I remember when we were talking about your big idea, and the room fell silent when you said,
Special education is broken.
right,
Yes.
exactly. I mean, I don't mean to laugh, it's not funny, but we were really struck by that. So talk a little bit about what your idea was and what the conversation looked like in your booth.
Yeah, I mean, this was something, so I have been covering special education since 2004, so this was, a decade plus of time covering special education. And of course, there are many stories that I wrote about innovative programs that were happening, teachers doing amazing work, parents doing great things, kids making great strides.
Right.
But obviously one issues that, there were several issues that come up repeatedly about funding, about identification, about teacher pay, about understanding just what special education is. And so I, kind of wanted to provocatively say that maybe the way that we're conceptualizing special education right now is not really doing as well as for kids as it could be. And it's interesting in the booth. I think that there was a lot of people who seem very willing to ask those big questions. What is it that we should be doing? There even was some talk about, is special education the way that it is sort of set separately from general education, or at least Title I legislation? Does that sort of create this system where you have some kids who are thought of as somebody else's problem? So what I really appreciated in my booth is that people were really taking the big ideas. I mean, nobody was saying like, well, maybe we should talk about some small categorization change or something. People are willing to think big about this.
And can you give us one big idea that you heard in the
Yeah, I think that one thing that people were talking about was the idea of dual certification, which is not necessarily a new idea, but the idea that general education, it was talked about many times. Most special education students spend most of their time in the general education classroom. General education teachers often say they don't know very much about kids with disabilities or how they learn. Why is that? We've known this for some time, that where general education students, where special education students spend their time. So the idea is like, how can we bridge this gap?
Right.
So there was a lot of conversation about that.
And do you think that could help the retention issue for special ed teachers?
Well, that's a challenging one. I think that the retention issue for special education teachers can't be looked at separately from the retention issue from teachers. But I mean, one thing that you just see is like special education teachers, a lot of times they don't always make as much as general education teachers. The burdens on them are higher, just because of, special education just comes with a lot of other sort of legal pieces that they have to work with. They may be isolated in their schools. There's a lot of stuff to think about.
Okay, your favorite topic, testing. Tell us.
Well, my big idea, I think, was actually born out of frustration, because after years and years of covering testing, I think we've sort of had the same very circular conversations about it. And in effect, we have this testing ecosystem where, because of federal law, we have to test annually, and so periodically people will say, well, let's not do that. And then you get a lot of people very concerned that if we don't have annual tests, then we won't be able to have as clear a picture of how students are progressing, that we'll lose some of the disaggregated data. And on the other hand, I think there are some real negative side effects from this. Namely, to me, one of the most important is that teachers are so divorced from the testing process in the United States, which is not at all the way it works in most international countries, right? Where they're deeply involved in design, scoring, and I don't think anyone's ever like, yay, a test, but they feel some degree of ownership over it in a way here where it just seems like some random company is forcing you to do this test and you don't know why and you don't get the results. And so it was really a thought piece trying to say, first of all, so I don't have to write the story again, like that if you choose to do annual assessments, there are other things you cannot do. You cannot give 4-hour performance exams. You cannot it costs too much. You are generally limited, not entirely, but generally limited to measuring lower level skills that, rather than the stuff that we say we all care about, right? Like deep analysis, research, sort of development of thinking over long periods of time. So what I did in the essay was lay out we could do every other year. We could maybe test samples of students, which, would have the downside of losing some of the disaggregated data. But the bottom line is the essay is about trade-offs, right? And I don't think we've been willing to look at the trade-offs in testing in a really clear-eyed way. And so it was sort of a something to offend everyone piece to say, look, there are choices here.
Right.
We need to confront those.
And what were you hearing in the booth, though? Were you getting pushback or?
No, actually, I think there was sort of widespread agreement. We solved all the problems in an hour. Just kidding, Elizabeth. Okay. We did not. I think there was an acknowledgement that these are issues. I was struck by, how knowledgeable the people in the room were, and they were bringing up a lot of issues that I really didn't go deep on for space reasons in
Yeah.
the piece, but that I think are very germane to the conversation.
I mean, and getting back to this issue of, teacher ownership over testing, I mean, how far away are we from something like that? I mean, obviously this would have to be rolled back all the way to teacher prep. Like, how do you
I think
envision
there's
something
that, but
like
I mean,
this?
you can look at something like the UK where you have, O levels and A levels. So these
Right.
are credentials that are linked to passage of a test. But those tests are, I mean, every year these exam boards come together and they
Right.
say in British literature these 6 texts will be covered. It doesn't mean you can't do
Right.
other ones, but I mean they are very clearly aligned to what's going on in a classroom in a way I think our tests are not. Now. You could sit and argue about whether you want to read Silas Marner this year or not. You know what I mean?
Right,
But
right.
I think the point is that there is sort of less of a we don't know what's going to be on this. We're unfamiliar with the format.
course.
It's just much more closely aligned. These are all exams that need to be hand scored.
Right.
Because they involve a lot of essay and writing. I mean, call me crazy as an English major, but I think measuring those things are important, and we don't do that very well or very often here. So, that's an example. But that is just not how we test here.
Right, and obviously the whole issue of engagement is a way to keep people more interested in what's happening rather than, top down, you got to do this, and then it's an awful experience for the teacher and obviously not much fun for the kids. So, sorry, were you going to say something? No. Okay. I wanted to ask you this question because when we were talking about your piece last year, and I wondered if this came up at all in your booth, but the questions that you're hoping that researchers will pursue in terms of digging into this whole issue around military students and this weird sort of anomaly in testing and performance. Testing, not so much performance. But anyway, so what I know you want to ask, and did it come up in the booth, questions that you hope that researchers will pursue as they look into this?
Yes, I mean, I was kind of surprised at the response. I mean, a lot of folks have a lot of assumptions about what's actually happening in military households, that, our fathers are more disciplinarians, or, or that we live in 2-parent households, et cetera. But, most military kids, they live with one parent. Oftentimes they have a parent deployed. I do think that one of the things that I think are worth exploring, some things such as the sort of political capital that military can bring with families. I mean, Black families for centuries now have been fighting for equal access to education, and oftentimes their schools are not well funded, if they have a school at all. I mean, my grandfather grew up in a community in which there was no high school. And all of a sudden, the military, you have an entire military force that's not only saying, you have to provide my employee's child an education, but you have to provide them a quality education. How does that change the political dynamics? How does that change the funding dynamics? There's also a lot of talk about the sorts of stability in schools that military kids go to. So military bases, they oftentimes ask for a much more stable teaching force, but then also a system that can allow for a lot of transferring. And so that means that they have clean, good records. They know what classes they're taking. They are able to transfer IDA forms, the sorts of things that a lot of schools really struggle with because they have sort of a chaotic lesson plans or chaotic administration. They have a lot of turnover, et cetera, and so they actually can't handle a lot of transferring. And then just a lot. There's a big emphasis on STEM programs and at schools around military bases. One of the things that the military bases are always asking local schools to provide, because there's some standardization around STEM curriculum, and there's also standardization around AP and IB courses. And so oftentimes they ask school districts to provide that so that the transferring is a lot easier. And so now all of a sudden you have Black kids that are having access to these gifted courses that, all of a sudden the expectations are much higher than what they're experiencing in traditional schools. So these are things that they can track now and that they can share with other schools.
So we're out of time, but I want to ask Christina one fast question. IDEA.
Yes.
Give me a number. How many years do you think it's going to take to reauthorize? And you could say I have no idea.
I have no idea, but I will tell you that a lot of people in the field have no problem waiting.
Okay.
They think that the political climate now is considered not favorable for this. So we'll see.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank everybody out there. This is Education Week. Please go to edweek.org to read everything else about big ideas and to follow up on any of these topics. Thanks so much for joining us.